Hey everyone, good to see you today here at the Compliance Corner. My name's Milan, and today in this channel, what we're going to go through are a number of things that have to do with how do you make a good decision around a business requirement for a new framework. A lot of people get angry and they get upset when the compliance team in particular might have agreed to go do a new framework for some kind of new certification. And there are a number of parties that really need to be involved in order to make sure that you're not, unfortunately, making a bad decision and then costing people time and money and all sorts of things that they may not want to go do. So, what are we going to talk about today in that space? My name's Milan, and I've been on both sides of the fence. I've been on the engineering team when I've had the compliance team come to me and say, hey, we need to go get this new framework. We have all this new evidence that's required. And oh, by the way, the audit starts next week. To now on the other side of it, where I manage SaaS compliance for a number of different services where we're trying to integrate with the engineers effectively. And it just can be very challenging to work across both those lines as well as others. And today, what we're really going to talk about are the business costs and considerations for not only the dollars it takes with the third party auditors, but also some of the unforeseen costs on engineering and the operations and security team as we really look to bring together a great business case to ensure that when we pick up these new certifications, they're going to have the right return on investment, or what we call ROI. And I think there's been a lot of misperceptions about what it means from a compliance perspective to really go after all of these different certifications as the world continues to expand, whether it's regionally, for governments, in terms of like the way we go after all of these different certifications, which are really features for the product. And they really open up a lot of value for the company, but they can have a very high associated cost, and it can add a lot of friction to the entire process as unplanned work as well. So today we're going to talk about the key things to review, along with some good practices and some tools you might want to put in place to really make it effective and an effective conversation so everybody is on the same page and they all have the right expectations and what it's going to take to go and actually gain that new certification, and hopefully with the ultimate goal to increase revenue for your product and the company. So, as you approach a new audit, I think I'm going to start with the sales teams, because really you don't want to go get certifications unless it's going to result in actual revenue for the company. Now, I can tell you, and I'm going to use a little story here. When I started in one of my jobs when I was managing compliance certifications, it was like a Saturday or a Sunday morning. I can't even remember now. It was a number of years ago. But my phone, which everybody in the company had my cell phone number, it rang at like 5 a.m. or something. Like, it was really early for me. And so the phone rings and I pick it up, half dazed, sleep, and say, hello. And the person on the other line was a salesperson in Europe. And they said, hey, Milan, I saw your name on bridge letters, and I've got this deal I can't really close it, but I don't have a lot of time left. I need to know today, can we have this certification in this European data center? Because if you don't have it there, then I'm not going to be able to close the deal. And I'm sitting there going, okay, what? Like, what product is this? Like, what are we talking about? And so, as I started waking up, I finally got around to asking the ultimate question, which was, how big is this deal that we want to go sign? And literally the answer was 30,000 euros. And I was like, 30,000 euros? This call isn't even worth talking about 30,000 euros. So it really is important that when we talk about ROI, I mean, you can't even go do the audit with paying the auditor 30,000 euros to get the audit. So it's really important, especially if you're a compliance leadership, to really understand and be able to help the teams pull together this business value of costs. And a lot of people in the past that I've seen, they focus on the costs of the audit, which could be anywhere, 50 to 150,000 or even more today to go pay that money. But in actuality, that's a very small cost of what it takes to go obtain and maintain audits. And I think it's so important that everybody spends some time, whatever company you're in, to really understand the process of how you go about that. So with the sales team, I really suggest that you have to have them really vet the opportunities. And we're going to talk about a couple of things here. The first thing we talk about is market opportunity. Sales teams will use that a lot, and they'll say, well, we've got a $400 million opportunity here. Well, that may be true. Like, maybe that's what Gartner hopefully says that the industry spends for that industry in that vertical. in that region maybe to say, hey, the say IT spend is a big one. This is how much IT spend is there. So, well, that's great, but just because there's an opportunity, it doesn't necessarily mean that the product that we're dealing with, our products, will actually meet that need. And so, while that opportunity is there, it doesn't mean that we could actually address that. And I don't want to sound negative about this, but salespeople are paid on commission. And so you really want to look at what level of management is this ask coming from. Like in my case, for that 30,000 euro ask, it was coming from a line salesperson. Remember, they make money off of a sale. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the requirement will be a good overall business reason to go get that certification. So like in these cases, it's really important to start asking up the sales management chain for validation of the real opportunity. My experience, when you get to the VP, especially SVP level in most of the major companies, they do a really good job and they know the numbers and they know the opportunities. Because even if, and I had this in one case, there might be a market opportunity in that space that one or two of the more junior sales members they want to go close a deal on, it doesn't mean that the rest of the sales machine is behind pushing that actual regional requirement as a major item. Because again, all that marketing and the salespeople, they have to be on board and you have to meet those two things together. And I found that sometimes that disconnect causes friction because you have the sales team, which maybe at the wrong level, asking for a framework that their management hasn't decided to push. So then engineering will go do work. Let's just say they go get that certification. They've expended money, which we'll talk about. And now they're asking, well, where are the dollars coming back? So it's really important that those leadership teams kind of meet eye to eye on the, hey, this is what we want to go after, and this is what we're prepared to go sell, and this is what we need from you engineering-wise to get that certification. Usually there's control work or some kind of work happening. And if those don't meet, it's going to cause a lot of friction. I've seen it over and over. And if you don't do the right prep work to vet the sales numbers at the right level, it becomes a challenge. Now, I've been asked, like, how do I do it? And it can actually be very self-limiting because if you get the right process in place saying that, hey, sales team, when you come with one of these asks, your senior leader is going to have to sit down in front of the 3 senior leaders, well, maybe 4, depending, that we'll talk about in a minute here, to get them to agree that if they have to go do work, it's worth the value to the company because there's going to be a cost associated. And again, a lot of the teams will focus on that actual dollar cost with the third-party auditors, but they don't factor in the engineering or the security or the operations cost that you may have to uplift in order to go get that certification. I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes here. So when we talk about the sales team, so we've talked about how to go and vet that in terms of a roll-up at a very high level. I mean, I'm not going into detail. There's a lot of details involved as you do the reviews. But let's talk about the 4-legged stool for the compliance feature. And I talk about this in some of the previous videos lightly. But compliance as a feature is way more complicated than an engineering product feature in most cases. Because a lot of times, for an engineering feature on a product, there's a single team that can go write the code for that. They might have to do some integrations, maybe with the operations team for change management, but in general, it's much more streamlined. Whereas a compliance feature has 4 legs to that stool. So the first leg, obviously, is like myself, is the compliance team. It's the team that has to work with the third-party auditors, gather the evidence, understand the framework, do that translation of evidence asks and what the audit certification requires into an engineering asks, and then obviously help the team with getting the evidence. Well, then you have, let's say, the product team. This is the team that actually owns the product, or the feature teams. They're the ones that will usually have to go do work, say if the evidence doesn't exist. They're going to have to go write a feature to gather certain evidence. Then you have the operations team, which has a lot to do with change management, disaster recovery, and those things are usually involved in every certification as well. And then the 4th leg of that stool is the security team, which is usually separate. There's usually security-specific controls in almost every framework that the security team will have to support one way or another, whether it's through quarterly entitlement reviews or whatever it is. There's plenty of controls in all the different frameworks where the security is there. So now you have 4 teams that you really have to have agreement with that they can support these new frameworks. Because many times what you'll end up seeing is that while And in my experience, it's usually the compliance team through the sales team asking, or even the product teams, because a lot of times the sales teams will approach the product teams directly, and then they'll say, hey, yeah, we want to go after this market and this opportunity, but they haven't vetted out what the gaps may be in the other legs of the stools to look at the overall costs, because it's not even just the costs. And remember, a lot of times this is unplanned work. And so if any one of these teams can't sign up to meet the schedule, guess what? Friction. And that friction gets ugly because now you have three other teams, or two other teams at least, who are investing time and money in order to get this certification, which now usually has a sales timeline associated with it. And they weren't prepared for that. And so it is so critical that these four legs of these stools are pulled together in order to agree that the ROI is there. So let's talk about what it means to get that buy-in. And this is where the rubber hits the road. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the mechanics of doing this, because in the end, I do think the compliance team should be the ones driving this process when it comes in. Because remember, the first thing you're going to get is a request for a framework. Now, the real question remains is, are we doing a lot of that work already for other frameworks? Because again, a lot of these frameworks build upon each other, or they're very similar from one region to another. And a lot of the evidence can be reused. So you really have to start back at the root, which is, do you have a really good way to collect this evidence? Are you mapping it against frameworks? And can you compare those frameworks as they come in, which will give you what I call the overlap or coverage you already have. So let's say there's 100 pieces of evidence in a SOC report. There's way more. I'm using a round number for ease of explanation. And say there's this new framework coming in, and you have a system where you can then translate those audit requests that you know are coming from the auditor into the actual tracking system, if you want to call it, and comparative system that says, hey, this control in this new framework is the same as this control. And if the timelines line up, the evidence is exactly the same. So we really don't have to go do more work. And I can tell you that, lots of teams are going through this now, or they should be, because now what you can do is look at generally how many controls, because an audit really comes down to evidence and controls. Do you have to go uplift in order to meet that new framework? And let's say that if you do that mapping in this system and you can spit out a report that says, oh, 60% of the controls, or even up to 70%, if we align the dates and times appropriately for the period, we can just use the same evidence. Well, that's great intel to say, well, the uplift for this new framework might be 30% new controls. Let's say 30 controls. Then let's say those controls are split between those four legs, because some might be ones that the compliance team goes and validates with corporate, security, feature team, and then of course operations. Well, now they can cost those out and say, okay, if I have these 10 of these 30 controls are mine, how much is that going to cost me, and how long will it take me to go do that? Because now if we're saying that we're going through this exercise, it means that the ROI that was approved at the right sales level is worth figuring out the gap. Because if the sales number isn't going to be valid, you don't even want to go figure out the gap today, because it's likely going to be a lot of work. So you can track this over time to see the pressure build. But if you can actually, look at these controls and cost them out, and then each leader of those four areas can say, yep, I can do it by this date. I can do it by this date. This team will do it by this date. And so you'll have a long pull where then you can credibly make that commitment to say, wow, the value to the company for this opportunity, which we all agree is there, is good. We understand the gap, which the compliance team generally can help set that up because they have to do the comparative view of the controls. And now we understand the cost. Now every leader who signs up, and if everybody signs up, then everything's happy, you go and execute it, then you can start selling. Now let's say, and this happens too, that 3 of them can and 1 can't. It opens a really good conversation to say, okay, I understand, let's say operations, you can't meet this timeline. Well, what help can any of the rest of the engineering teams give you so we can meet that? Because again, this could be good revenue for the company. So let's work together on a really good way to go meet this result, so we can then go and get the certification and then start selling. The sales team can then plan for it and then start the motions. So if you notice with that model, then it sets a very clear expectation about what it means and everybody approving the work to get there. And that friction naturally goes away. And I think it's that friction piece that I've noticed that teams that do this really well, that friction reduces. And also, if you can't do it, because sales teams will usually escalate to the very senior engineering leader, then again, you have this coalition of all the people who have to deliver into this feature that agree that it's important, but let's just say there's certain things that just can't be done or can't be done on the timeline. And it's much more effective to have the four-legged stool on the same page with the leaders, because then the conversation becomes much more constructive and productive, as the senior leader might have other resources in other areas that could help out to plug those gaps if the value's high enough. And I kind of mentioned the self-limiting aspect of the sales ask. So I'm going to touch back on that for a minute. The thing that works is that, like I know when it's happened to me, I would tell the sales team, look, I'm telling you no, like I've already talked to the leaders. We can't take any unplanned work. The numbers that you have don't seem to be solid enough. You don't have Gartner reports, well, we'll do a quick, cut at that. But then if they feel their numbers are strong and their senior leader, at my level or higher is willing to go to my boss and sit down with the numbers, and I tell them that, say, hey, you can escalate on me if you really think it's there. I'm just telling you that I'm not going to reprioritize myself or the other teams to do this because we don't think your numbers are strong enough or high enough in the overall business model to go. But feel free to escalate on me. That's totally fine. And it was kind of funny, a real funny story on this is I was doing this process. I have an intake tool. We bring all these requests in. If I can lump them together, that kind of helps the story if they're coming from different sales teams. But I had one. And what I would tell each of the leaders is, look, I don't think it's here. I've talked to my peers, the operations, security, and engineering peers. We can't fit this in. We have other priorities. But if you feel that this opportunity is that critical, feel free. I'll help you set up the meeting with my boss, and he can overturn all of us and make us go do it, and then we'll go and reprioritize. And what I found was that in most cases, they're not strong with that number, because remember, sales teams, again, if you take the worst light of it, they're paid on commission. So any commission that's over zero is a commission in their pocket. They don't pay the engineering costs to get these done. The engineering team does. So that's where that model has to self-limit how you go about vetting those requirements. Now, I had it in one case where they did escalate. I told them, I said, look, I'm telling you, I know the boss. This isn't going to be enough, but hey, we're happy to do it. And it was really interesting because my manager said, you're turning down revenue? I said, well, yeah, because let me add up the costs here, and then we'll show what they're saying this one deal is. Well, that's not enough to go invest. And remember, when you do a compliance framework, it's not a one and done. You have to factor the ongoing yearly costs of it as well. So it really puts that business-centric view on compliance as a feature that I think is so critical as we move forward, because it's still coming down to how much money you spend on it. And so much focus in my engineering past has been on just the dollar aspect of what we're paying the auditors, where the actual engineering cost is usually way higher than that, not only immediately to get the audit completed, but long-term in just what it means to go and pay for it year over year. Because if the money's not there, then it becomes a sunk cost. And I talked in a couple of the previous episodes about the metrics that you use to justify and capture those costs for engineering. And they're becoming so much more important as compliance continues to evolve and mature, because the days of the blank checkbook and the bat, as I say continuously, they're gone forever. Like, you cannot keep throwing money at these. And frankly, if you don't do these efficiencies, like mapping frameworks so you understand the gap and you can then most efficiently put things in the right period so you can get the maximum use of a single collection of a piece of evidence, then the entire system's going to buckle under the weight. Because again, when you think about the audit process and certification process, while engineering has changed to a much more rapid cadence of getting features out, getting products out the door, the compliance work hasn't. And they haven't changed how we actually do auditing. The example that I mainly use on that is SOC 1 Type 2 audits. Instead of changing how it works, now we have to do them 4 times a year to ensure the drift doesn't change. But the actual process hasn't changed along with the engineering, which I can think of some better ways to do it, but that's a much longer term discussion. But again, this comes down to how do you validate those business costs over time, and how do you make good, quick decisions on it? Now, we've talked retroactively, so I want to spend just a few minutes and talk about proactive work on this and how this can more positively impact what I call time to certification. So we did talk about the fact that when you get in these requests and you start bundling them, you start vetting them, you're pretty far down the process. If there's like a really big deal, let's just use the example because I've seen these. A huge deal comes in where they need this new certification. And how long does it take to go get any new certification on a new product? Generally speaking, I mean, it could be 4 to 6 months to a year to go figure out the product gaps, to go do the engineering work on the product gaps. Then you got to go put them into production. Then you got to vet them. Like, seriously, the SLA I tend to use is if we haven't done this prep work ahead of time and we know the gaps and are working to fix them, it could be 6 months to a year before we can actually have that certification if a customer won't go live without it. And that's the chicken and egg problem with the ROI validation. So if you think, though, about the good practices we've talked about, which is having a repository where you can map frameworks, you can look at the market opportunities. Well, you do all that work depending on your leadership team and how you look at the value to say, hey, if we are seeing a Gartner report that says the market spend in this region with a similar product to ours, 500 million a year, and we're not selling it all there, now you could then go map that framework into your system and see what the gap is proactively. And you may or may not actually go fix those issues with engineering, but you can raise them and say, listen, we went through and reviewed this, and we see that there's a 30% gap and increase we have to go do. These controls fall in these different categories to these different control owners, whether they're security, operations, feature team, or compliance. And we can go cost those out even. So the question then is, okay, we see the trend moving in this direction. Should we get ahead of it? And that is a very powerful conversation and set of metrics of costs and ROI to go put in front of leadership teams. They may want to make a strategic bet that says in this region, we want to actually increase our footprint without having blocked deals. Then you can actually get the right people on board leadership-wise and say, look, we're not going to see an immediate return on this, but the strategy is that we're going to move into that region. And if we're going to do that, we have to have these frameworks. So over the next 4 to 6 months, before we have blocked deals, we need to go make that early investment. It's a very powerful tool and way to go utilize this work proactively versus just reactively. Because again, when it comes in late and hot, there's a block deal. They want the certification in like 2 to 3 months to close the deal and get them into production. That is not a very easy proposition. And that also causes a lot of friction because the senior leader may say, go do it, which means if you can, meaning you can't always get auditors that fast, but let's say you can, then you still have to reprioritize a bunch of engineering work because that's unplanned work. That means other things move out, and nothing makes engineers and everybody more upset than unplanned work. So, in this discussion, which is, really meant around the business decisions, we talked about a number of things. We talked about, how do you do the business and the engineering costs? Again, it's very important to look at those things to say, hey, is the actual engineering costs getting covered for what it's going to be? Not just the money, whether it's 50 to 300,000 to pay the auditors, but then what is that engineering cost to not only immediately get that certification, but then maintain it year over year? Really have to think about that. The next thing is, do you have representation at the right level from the four legs of the stool? Do you have the senior engineering leader or the product leader, the ops leader, the security leader, and the compliance leader, all at least in a process on the same page about how we're going to vet these requirements, cost them out, and then make a recommendation based on the sales numbers, whether they're good or not? Then, the other one was the sales numbers. How do you vet those? Ideally, you get them from a more senior member of the sales team that then can put a lot of weight behind the sales motion, and then they take some accountability for the actual sales numbers. And then last but not least is, okay, how do you not only get buy-in, but then also proactively kind of do the work? Again, getting the buy-in really comes from the transparency of having people be able to take that translated framework from the compliance team, cost out their area of that, figure out how and when they can do it in what time frame, and then obviously be able to commit to that. And then obviously the execution of it from a proactive state is, if you do a really good job with this, you can start then looking at frameworks and areas ahead of time And there's a number of different factors you can look at for that: sales pipelines, Gartner reports, compare it against your product to make sure you can actually sell it. Then you can get ahead of it. And I think that's where the real power is, where you can actually get ahead of these frameworks versus playing catch up. But in order to do that, you have to kind of flip how we think about vetting these requirements and then actually getting them to the appropriate owners for execution and delivery. So that's just a really quick view from a business perspective of the kind of things that I know I look at it for a senior compliance position along with my peers. And it's been very impactful for us to have these conversations because we can also set much better expectations with our senior leaders on what it means to expand the product line into new areas of the country, of not only our country, but the world, and new verticals and industries. So I really hope this has been helpful to you. You know, if you have any questions, since this wasn't really a live discussion, please put questions down in the comments. I'll go take a look at them and I'll either answer in the comments directly, or if it's with a good topic, I'll put it on the next live stream. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I hope everyone has a great compliance day and best of luck with your ROI. Thank you.